And before we dive in, just want to give you some context as to why I'm talking about social's impact on media today. At SimpleReach, what we do is we track every social engagement for our media partners of their content across Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, kind of anywhere that your users are engaging, sharing, promoting your content. We're finding out everything we can about that sharing. I'm realizing I'm mic'd up and I don't have to stand over there. We find everything we can out about that sharing, who's sharing it, how much reach do they have, what's their clout score, we're hitting their API, and then we're tying that all back to the traffic driven to that article. So not only how's your content being shared around the social web, but how's that converting into monetizable traffic to your property. But today we're not going to talk too much about SimpleReach. In this kind of frenetic world of mobile and social and the information overload we've been talking about, I wanted to pull up to a 5-10 year picture and talk about how social is changing the media business fundamentally. And there was a great blog post last week by Andy Weissman from Union Square Ventures, who's one of the primary founders of Twitter. And it was titled The Great Fragmentation, and I thought it really elegantly captured what the internet does, not only in media, but across industry. And the way he phrased it was, what if the power of the internet is that it unbundles all that came before? This should make sense to everyone in media because we've seen the internet unbundle various parts of media. I think distribution, obviously, was the first thing that really changed the game for media. Freely distribute information, right? Fundamentally different. Monetization, the last 5 years, we've seen amazing advances in separating monetization from pulling an audience together. Right? You can aggregate an audience today and you can outsource the monetization. But what we didn't see until social was a fundamental change in the way we solve the signal-to-noise problem that we've had since Gutenberg created the printing press. Right? It's editorial curation. It's smart people telling you, they've looked at all the news, you've got 20 minutes, this is what matters. Even the attempts in Web 1.0, the Google News, tech meme, they rely on your editorial to say, okay, lots of people are talking about this is important, right? 10 different editorial groups thought it was important. But fundamentally, they're still relying on solving that problem through experts. And I think what social has really changed about the media business is you're no longer curating your own content, and decreasingly so, because your audience now curates itself. Let's look at the underlying sources, right? The two behemoths, right? Everybody knows how big Facebook is, 955 million active users monthly. It's a crazy number. Almost full penetration in the US, almost nowhere to go there, and yet our data and other people's data that track these sorts of things show that content is Facebook's an increasingly important source of traffic for content. That continues to grow. The audience isn't growing for them, content driving is. Content's becoming a more and more part of that experience. And if you look at why, I think we have Twitter to thank partially, because for power users, for early adopters of Twitter, this content curation was a fundamental part of how you built your reputation, your brand. You were the content creator. You told people what was interesting in your industry. And now the interesting thing about this fragmentation is it happens to social networks as well. You've seen the rise of not generalist networks, but networks for particular types of content or use cases or communities. Look at Pinterest. They said, yeah, you can show that aesthetically pleasing photo-heavy content on Facebook or Twitter, or we can create a UI that's fundamentally about that, that's about sharing those things, putting them together, curating them, and sharing them with your friends. Right? You've got StumbleUpon, which is kind of the dark horse of social traffic driving, by the way. There have been a lot of reports about this, but StumbleUpon drives more than 5% of traffic for a bunch of our properties. And it's really about a very specific type of situation you're in as a user. You want something intellectually curious. Or intellectually stimulating, you're intellectually curious. Reddit, Reddit as a technology is actually kind of bland, right? It's come together, vote things up, vote them down, weight the community. But inside of Reddit has developed a really interesting community with different social norms. Subreddits have their own kind of personalities. And as a content creator, a share across each one of these places, Pinterest, StumbleUpon, and Reddit, tells you something very different about your content. And finally, we've got one of our co-hosts, Pulse, has just recently put more social in kind of curation into their product with their kind of top now. Flipboard, remarkable growth. Flipboard just reported more than 3 billion flips per month. I mean, right? You guys probably use Flipboard. You flip it over, basically a page view. More than 3 billion page views, and that's socially curated content. The point is, across all of these, we're seeing more and more traffic being driven by social. There are a lot of sites that we work with where search has now been surpassed by social, and a lot of sites where the lines are trending that way. The point is, the curation game has fundamentally changed, and we see that in things like homepages being of less import. You guys see that in your traffic numbers. This is why. That's why every article has to be a landing page, because it's being shared socially, and that's how people are getting to you. That's how you're finding great content. Now, the good news about this, social channels driving more and more of your traffic and being where people find and discover your content, is that you're as important to social as they are to you. If you want to know what's important to Facebook, and Facebook's the biggest traffic driver to almost every site that we provide analytics for, look at what Mark Zuckerberg said in his shareholder letter during the IPO process. He said, "This business is around to support the product." Now think about that. This is a CEO of a publicly traded company saying that his business, the profits, the revenue, are around to support the product and make it better. Product is religion at Facebook, and what do you see them doing with the product? You see them making it really easy, increasingly easy to share content, even from their competitor networks. Within the last year, you've seen, and I share a lot of content by linking my Twitter account, and I can tell you that them pulling in Twitter icons, them pulling in a small kind of, first bit of the article, the headlines, this is all relatively new. They're making explicitly changes to the product to highlight content, to make it more attractive, to make it a bigger part of the experience. And I think it's no coincidence that one of the few strategic board members on the Facebook board is the chairman of the Washington Post. I don't think that's accidental. I think Mark Zuckerberg knew from the start that content is a fundamental part of the way that people connect with each other and engage with each other. And then look at the other end of the spectrum, LinkedIn. I think this was a surprise to some of us. This is a snapshot of the homepage of LinkedIn, a recent redesign they did this year. And LinkedIn, the majority of their revenue is driven by jobs, right? I mean, it's driven by postings and listings, and yet they understand that to get people to come back every day, what you need is socially curated content. You have to show people content they're engaged in, and the way they figure that out is by what's getting the most sharing activity on their networks. Now, the other good news about this is there's no man behind, there's no man behind the drape here. I'm looking for the Wizard of Oz analogy, but this is people actually sharing your content. This is not an algorithm that can be updated. This cannot be gamed. There's no, demand media in this situation in which they can game the social, because people follow each other. If people with lots of followers start sharing bad content, people are going to stop following them. It's a true meritocracy. Great content gets shared. They've also been great partners from a data perspective. It allows us to do our job. Unlike, say, the video realm, in the content realm, within social, they've been sharing all of the data that they have, all the interaction data via APIs. And so hopefully now I've convinced you that the way people find and engage and discover content is changing. And hopefully I've just convinced you that it's not such a scary thing to be getting most of your traffic from social, or an increasing percentage. Now let's look at how that traffic gets to you. Well, how do you get after this wave of social traffic that's going to content? And so we thought it'd be interesting to look at the data with this 1% lens. In the last year or two, the country's been talking about the disparity between, how wealth is distributed. And the Wall Street Journal, I just looked this up yesterday, estimates that 31% of financial wealth in this country is held by the top 1%. Quick show of hands, a little interactive. Who thinks that social has an even greater disparity than the financial wealth in this country? Who thinks that the top 1% of social drives more than 31% of total social traffic? Yes? Yeah? Who thinks less? Less than 31% by the top one? Less? All right, good. It's more than double. This to us is a fairly shocking statistic. I mean, think about this for a second. The top 1% of traffic driving articles on Twitter drive more than 60% of total traffic. On Facebook, it's 70%. What does this tell you? Well, a couple of things. One is that if you're not understanding how you get into this 1%, if you're not focused on being a part of this 1%, you're leaving 2/3 of the traffic driving potential of social on the table from the start. The other thing when we dug in that's interesting is that this is not only big sites. We have several sites we track that have more than 100 million monthly page views, that have millions of Twitter followers, and yet several blogs that we tracked were in this top 1% of traffic driving articles on an absolute basis, not on a relative basis. And a number of sites with less than 5 million monthly uniques were also in these top 1%. So the point is that it's not about getting the most followers. It's not about putting sharing tools on your site. You should do those things. Those are smart. They give you more reach. But that is not how you win this game. You win this game by being in the top 1%. And the top 1% of content is great content. This is really hard to do well. The other thing that was interesting is that this holds across content types. This is not lolcats and celebrities. This holds in science. This holds in health. We looked across, not these exact numbers obviously, but this dynamic, that the top 1% drives a majority of traffic. And we also thought we'd look at which social networks, or kind of how the social networks perform relative to each other, which is to say, when something does really well on Facebook, does it do really well on Twitter? And particularly for two relatively generalist social networks with scale, we were pretty shocked to see that only 20% of the top 1% of traffic driving articles on Twitter are also in the top 1% on Facebook. These are fundamentally different networks. And if you don't think this Venn diagram overlap is smaller when you look at something like Pinterest compared to this, or Reddit compared to this, you're crazy. These are all very unique environments. You need to understand them uniquely. You need to understand your audience and what's creating sharing behavior. And the good news about all of this is that, yet again, content is king. If you look at why content gets shared, let's think about what that behavior is. It's a really strong behavior, particularly for people that have the kind of audiences that allow you to garner quite a bit of traffic to get into this top 1%. It's saying, I'm associating my personal brand, with this content. This is my voice to some degree. And so, what we see is that the best content gets shared, but also you have an enormous number of tools, an enormous amount of data from these social filters, from all this interaction that's happening around the web, to understand some of the core things that media companies have been doing really well for 100 years. One of them is understanding their audience. I think the fact that cloud exists speaks to how much we're all publicly sharing of our personas, of our presence. You can understand when someone tweets about you what the reach is, what they're influential about, what their station is. Also voice. I was happy to hear Scott mention voice and authenticity. It's a very amorphous thing, obviously, and some of the questions spoke to that. But you can gather data around which topics resonate with your audience. When do you speak with a compelling voice? When do you speak with an authentic voice? And I think the best data point you can have is that a bunch of your readers said, yes, that's something I want to share with my friends. I just want to share with people that I've built up as an online following, my personal brand. And finally, brand. I think there's a lot of fear that because pieces of content are being shared, as opposed to people coming directly to the site, or that because you don't have that homepage to talk about what you care about and set that kind of dining room table conversation, that brand is less important. I would actually argue it's more important in a distributed world of sharing. I think that there's a reason why branded link shorteners make a lot of sense, because when I see an article on Facebook, on Twitter, I'm immediately making a whole bunch of assumptions about what's going to be in that piece of content based on the brand that it's coming from. I would argue it's more important than ever to convey strongly through your brand what someone should expect when they click on something, because they only have 120 characters if they're sharing a link to tell you anything about it. So when I see news about the economy from The Economist, I'm likely to click. I see a music review from Rolling Stone, I'm more likely to click on that. And when we look at our data, we do see big disparities between how frequently people click, and anecdotally, strong brands convert better. When they get distribution. So, in closing, just wanted to say that all of those things are, I think, kind of old principles of journalism. Understanding the audience, connecting with an authentic voice, and understanding where your brand works and who it works with and what it conveys. And there are more data points today, there are 10 times the data points today across all these various networks that, as I said, are great partners, share their data via APIs for you to understand all of those things better than you ever have. Thank you.